All right, everyone, thank you. I think we'll get started. So welcome to the fifth and final session. Thank you for making it through. 1 hour, 20 minutes, then a quick wrap up, and then we will be heading off to the Barbican Conservatory for those of you that can make it. Our final session today is on industrial policy in practice versus theory. Our chair today, who I will hand you over to, is Saravya Rao, Deputy Director of the Economy and Strategic Analysis Team in the UK Department for Business and Trade. Saravya, it's an absolute pleasure to have you chairing. Why, thank you, Saravya. The pleasure is actually all mine. Can I say what an amazing job you've done of chairing today? Oh, thank you, Saravya. Really, no, we must stop. Okay, here we go. Implementation. Implementation is an unbelievably important topic, if not as important as the policy itself. And just wanted to give a few very quick framing comments before we launch into the presentations. So the first, I think, is maybe a quite recognition from some of you about what it's like to be working on an industrial strategy or a major economic policy, to see a great deal of political, policy, and analytical attention paid to it up until that point of publication, but then perhaps that attention waning away after it's been published. So how do we continue to focus minds and achieve that delivery? Another thing that's been talked about a lot today at various points has been about the time it takes for policies to bed in. So how do we make sure that we allow policies to really stick the landing without kind of experiencing the churn that we've talked about so much today and evolving it as it keeps going? And then the final thing is sort of capability, capacity, and institutions that set us up to deliver, which can be an area that governments find very challenging. And can often be what stands in the way of getting policies done right. So in a topic that is very broad, in a word delivery, which a lot of people use to mean quite different things and don't always know what they're talking about when they do use it, we've got 4 amazing panelists today that will give us each of their perspectives, and then as per usual, we'll open up to a Q&A. So our 4 panelists are Guy Leland, Acting Head of Division, Productivity, Innovation, Entrepreneurship at the OECD, Nathan Lane, Associate Professor of Economics at Oxford University, Joanna Almodovar, Head of Foresight and Public Policy at Inesc Tech, and apologies because I know that her job description is out of date on the written program, apologies about that. And finally, Mike Kyogan, the Director of Economics at the Ellison Institute of Technology at Oxford. Okay, well, over to you, Guy, to start the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Saravya. And I'm going to present on industrial policies in theory and practice. I just slightly changed the title to, I think, reflect the interplay between theory and practice, which is what we really need to improve our industrial policies. That being said, I'll spend most of my talk to describe what we observe in practice and just spend a few minutes on theory, because I think you've heard already some presentations on industrial policy theory. So starting with the reasons we are all here today, I mean, besides the legendary hospitality of our British colleagues, it's because we are witnessing the comeback of the industrial policy narrative. And I say the industrial policy narrative rather than the comeback of industrial policy, because in fact, most countries have always supported businesses, and they have often chosen specific technologies or specific activities to support. But what is really new is that governments are now implementing industrial policy much more openly. And there are several reasons why. I mean, first, because the perceived benefits of industrial policies have increased. I mean, you've heard many rationales for industrial policy actions since this morning. I won't repeat this. But also because there are lower perceived costs or risks to industrial policies. And this was the topic of the previous session. Industrial policies have the reputation of being detrimental to competition, but we've seen that competition has already decreased in most OECD countries over the last 20 years. Industrial policy also has the reputation to favor incumbents at the expense of young companies and new entrants, but we have increasing evidence that business dynamism has decreased in many OECD countries as well. So in short, industrial policies are not new, but they are undergoing significant and structural changes at the current juncture. And in this context, it's important to get industrial policies right. And this requires at least 4 ingredients. First, you need to have the good conceptual framework to design your policies. Then you need to have instruments to measure your industrial policies. You need to know what you are doing and what others are doing to have sound policies. You have to implement the policies in the right way, and finally, you have to evaluate them and ensure that your evaluation feeds back into policy design. I'll focus most of my talk on measurement, but let me just say a few words on theory, because it's important to get, in particular, the definitions right. And in terms of defining industrial policy, I think I just want to make 2 remarks. First, that industrial policies shouldn't be restricted to the manufacturing sector. We've heard a lot about interlinkages between sectors in the previous panels, of course, energy or services matter for the manufacturing sector. Second remark, we should consider jointly horizontal and targeted policies. Same, I don't have to repeat. This has been clear from previous panels that there are strong interactions between the 2 types of policies. So what about measurement? There are a variety of initiatives across different institutions. I'd like to focus, of course, on the OECD initiatives today. Just to mention quickly that there is this MAGIC initiative measuring government support at the company level in around 500 companies in 15 selected industrial sectors. But I'm going to spend the rest of my talk discussing about QUIZ, Quantifying Industrial Strategies, which is a complementary initiative measuring industrial policy expenditures and their composition across countries. Just a remark that in both initiatives, it's a focus on industrial policy expenditures, but of course, not all industrial policy entail expenditures. So we're going to focus on a subset of industrial policies. And I'm going to present a few selected results, but much more is available on our website, including country notes and the detailed data at the policy instrument level, if you're interested in that. And the results I'll present cover 11 OECD countries until 2022, but stay tuned because in a couple of months, we will update the data with more than 20 countries and until 2023. So let me present the results, starting with the level of industrial policies. I think the first finding is that industrial policy expenditures are sizable. On average, across the 11 countries we cover, industrial policy expenditures represent 1.5% of GDP in 2022 for grants and tax expenditures. And on top of that, we have 0.8% of financial instruments, that is to say, loans, guarantees, or government venture capital. And as you can see from the graph, there is a lot of heterogeneity across countries in the sample. What's perhaps even more interesting than the levels is the evolution of industrial policy expenditures. And on these graphs, we focus on the last 4 years, and we see that the increase is already quite substantial. As a share of GDP, industrial policy expenditures have increased by 10% just over the last 4 years. And this is valid not only for grants and tax expenditures, but also for financial instruments. This is far from negligible, but is perhaps not the explosive growth you can sometimes see in other databases or in the news. And the reason is because, in fact, industrial policies are very sticky. And we know that there is this asymmetry. It's easy to implement new industrial policies, but it's much more difficult, at least politically, to terminate industrial policies. In fact, in our sample, we see that less than 4% of industrial policies are terminated each year. Another way to present this is the half-life of an industrial policy measures is 18 years. So I talked about the macro figures. Let's look at the composition of industrial policy expenditures. And here, I'm zooming in on grants and tax expenditures. And what we do is we tag different industrial policy instruments according to what they call is their target. And by target, we don't mean the stated objective of the policy, but really what are the conditions to benefit from the policy in the law or in the regulation. And of course, policy can be allocated to different targets, because just to take an example, support to the greening of SMEs would fall here in both categories, green and SMEs. So as you see from this graph, the most frequent target in our sample of countries is sectoral policies. Between 30 and 40% of industrial policies are sectoral. And among the sectors targeted, you will find as the first sector energy, then transport, and third, manufacturing. Other important targets include R&D, the green transition, and generic support to investment. But as I mentioned at the beginning, this composition of industrial policies is undergoing significant changes. One of the first change is the decrease in sectoral policies. It's still the first category, but it has decreased significantly over the last years. On the contrary, what has significantly increased in terms of target is investment, but also support to the green transition. And I'll focus on this support to the green transition because I think it's particularly interesting for several reasons. First, despite the overall growth of support to the green transition, support through the energy sector has decreased. Why is that? Well, because energy prices have increased recently, and the support to the energy sector for its green transition, which is mainly support to the renewable energy production, has decreased accordingly. The second interesting point that you can see on this graph, or perhaps with what you can't see, is the support to manufacturing and transport. The red and blue bars are very small because, in fact, support to the green transition in the manufacturing and transport sectors are very low. In fact, if you consider the transport sectors, most of the industrial policies targeting the transport sector are support to energy use, and when I say energy use in the transport sector, it mostly means fossil fuels. What's also interesting in this graph is that you see that the increase in the green industrial policy expenditures is driven by an increase in cross-sectoral support. I wouldn't say it's really horizontal support because, in fact, what we see is that most of this support is targeted at specific ecosystems spanning different sectors. For instance, if you want to support hydrogen technologies, you're going to support hydrogen uptake in different sectors, in the transport sector, but also in the industry sector or in the energy sector. So, in fact, when you support the green transition, what we observe is that a large share of the new schemes are non-technology neutral. And this raises questions because, of course, we know that the government is not always the best place to choose the technology to target. This doesn't mean we shouldn't do that, because often there are no other ways to support the green transition, but probably that it deserves particular scrutiny and evaluation going forward. I'm going to stop talking about industrial policy expenditures and would like to finish my talk with another important trend regarding industrial policies and regarding the implementation of industrial policies. And of course, as we are in the United Kingdom today, I think it's important to mention the growing number of industrial strategies. And it's not only the United Kingdom, because just over the last 12 months, many OECD countries have published their industrial strategies. We've heard about Italy, but there is also Finland, Czechia, Norway, Australia, or Mexico that have published such plans over the last months. And this raises a range of new policy questions. It's not only which instruments, which policy instruments work best. It's not even which combination of instruments do we want to have to ensure the maximum impact, but it's also how do we govern these policies. And this provides a new incentives, a new layer for peer learning beyond the effectiveness of instruments, beyond the effectiveness of the different bundles of instruments. We need to learn from each other how to design and govern these industrial strategies. And I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.
So this is going to be a very practical talk and pretty high level. I'm someone who has been studying industrial policy, in fact, the kind of empirics of industrial policy throughout my academic career. And recently, the last couple of years, we've really been in the weeds of how do we evaluate this stuff? And really, I think it's fair to say, and I don't think this is a controversial statement, the return of industrial policy really caught us as economists, as academic economists, really flat-footed. I think it's kind of fair to say there's this missing literature. There's a missing literature on the empirics of industrial policy, getting into the nitty-gritty, granular policy evaluations of this stuff. We haven't had our attention shined in this route for quite a long time as economists. We've been really having to hit the ground running and build a literature kind of in motion. And really this whole kind of post-COVID world completely, I think it's fair to say, really caught the profession off guard. And so I'm going to talk about three things we're slowly learning. And the first thing, I want to talk about kind of the emerging body of empirical work, again, at a very high level, from academic economics. And a lot of people ask you, as an econometrician, hey, how do we evaluate success? And I think when you look at the literature on applied empirics, when you look at the literature of policy evaluation, and you look in the weeds of the papers and research groups that are trying to evaluate this stuff, and look at the best of our studies, it's really hard to see one exact method to study industrial policy success, right? Or think about one precise metric for thinking about the keys to a successful industrial policy. In fact, I think one has to be very, very pragmatic with this stuff. But then again, I think there's even more of a mismatch between kind of how we as economists, in fact, how we as econometricians approach the question of measuring industrial policy, and really the practical demands that we get from policymakers. These are very different things. Like we're focused on a real different stratum of stuff as econometricians, and really it belies and kind of blinkers us to a lot of the practicalities on the ground that also matter a lot. And that gets me to the third point that I'm going to touch on, which is practical points about industrial policy. A lot of, I think, the deficit with measuring industrial policy and success isn't about getting a new econometric estimator for measuring this stuff, or finding the kind of magic bullet data set for measuring this stuff. It's not about the fancy stuff. It's actually about the kind of hard grind of building high-frequency statistical capacity, measuring relatively dumb stuff. Like dumb from the vantage point of us as academic econometricians. So I just want to recall the definition of industrial policy, right? And the point is, industrial policy is intentional state action that's meant to kind of shape the composition of economic activity in an economy. And I state that not because I like being pedantic, but because industrial policy is a lot of stuff, right? You can think of people kind of, it's like furniture. Right? It's a definition that's a broad tent, principal definitions, whether it's Gies or my own or other agencies who try to define industrial policy within a framework. It's going to fix a lot of stuff. So by construction, right, this precludes one magic bullet for measuring this stuff in some precise, pristine way that we'd like to conceptualize policy measurement as econometricians in this way. Right? This definition really belies that. And so, why is that, right? Industrial policies have, just in practice, multiple objectives, right? They have their stated objectives and the objectives we map onto them as economists. We hope they produce social value. We hope they produce probably some aggregate productivity growth. right? Those might be much more distinct and different than the things that people on the ground want. Increasing TFP, reallocating output, reallocating or causing structural transformation in some long-term way, right? And by construction, I think as empiricists, I haven't found an industrial policy that didn't consist of a lot of stuff, right? There isn't one tau. It isn't one parameter. It's a lot of different stuff we, like countries, throw at this problem, right? Again, that's going to complicate the measurement of this, especially as econometricians, right? And there's going to be multiple time horizons. I'll get to that in a minute. That's going to complicate the way we view and measure industrial policy and the way we even conceptualize success and failure, right? There's multiple units of analysis. We think about firms. We think about local level labor markets. As economists really evaluating this, we often, hopefully, want to think about what are the aggregate effects of this stuff, right? There's all sorts of different horizons. So this is to say there's all these different dimensions of industrial policy that really, again, belie kind of one magic econometric method for studying the success of this stuff. All right, one of my favorite examples and kind of something that illustrates the ambiguity of what we mean by success is a friend of mine, Murto Kalupsidi and Panlay Gia Barwick's paper. They have a series of papers on the Chinese shipbuilding industry, right? And you look at this and you're like, shoot, China was really successful at building this targeted strategic industry. They did so. They were able to cannibalize the world market and really create a kind of new domestic industry, some would say out of thin air. They were able to reallocate investment into this sector. And by many metrics, especially if you're the CCP, especially if you're Xi Jinping, this looks like a success, right? Rightly so. But as economists, these papers usually argue, from an econometric perspective, that these are, in fact, failures, right? That this is a misallocation, that this stuff was hugely socially costly. Right? And I think both these things are true, but this is to say there's many different vantage points for thinking about success and failure, and there's always going to be a tension and ambiguity here. I don't think many of the planners of the Chinese strategic industry push here really cared all that much that this was socially costly, right? They wanted to build, for good reasons, a strategic industry. That was first and foremost. We as economists see this as a failure, right? So there's a divergence between political success and sometimes our success and our conceptualization of success as economists, right? And that work, if we go down the line and look at all the work covering industrial policy, let's just take one pocket of econometric work, a lot of structural work. I myself am working in semiconductors. We can think about the shipbuilding papers. We can think about a bunch of different industries. You look at all these papers, and they're all excellent papers, right? There's just, again, this new emerging literature here. But what one walks away from this literature with is like, oh shoot, there's a lot of ways to measure success and failure. And there should be, right? There should be, because this is a big tent. There's supply side policies being implemented. There's demand side policies being implemented. These are very different markets, right? Shipbuilding is a much different market than building a chip fab, right? And the chip fabrication foundries, right? So by construction, we should have very heterogeneous studies and very heterogeneous approaches to studying this stuff. And I want to say, I think this is a really strength of the literature. And this is a strength of what's emerging here, is that we're not ideologically tied to one method of evaluating success. And that bears out in all these very high quality studies, like these ones right here. They're all measuring this stuff, even with a very similar method, structural econometrics, right? They should be different, and by construction, they should be different and very context sensitive. And I think that's the best way to think about success within the context of the policies being implemented, right? But that said, we're again, I kind of hinted and alluded to this earlier, there's kind of a mismatch here, right? There's often kind of a mismatch between what we as economists think about when measuring industrial policy. We think about very high-level debates about success and failure. Is industrial policy possible or not? Were these things successful socially or not? Were the social returns to these things strong? Were there externalities, et cetera, right? But they're often different than the immediate things that policymakers are demanding from us. So the immediate questions and immediate concerns that people on the ground are kind of asking us about when it comes to efficacy, right? They're kind of much different. In the end, they might converge, and there are similarities. There is overlap. But right, as economists, we're thinking about the long run. Hey, what's the long-run effects of these things? Some of the policies I study, we study over the course of decades, What's the long-run equilibrium change from these things? Whereas people from different ministries are asking us about what's the short-term effects of these policies 10 years out, 3 years out, 4 years out, right? And our tools are much kind of misaligned to kind of asking these and trying to answer these questions and asking these questions about efficacy. How do we measure short-run efficacy, right? We're often, as economists, worried about very downstream outcomes as a consequence. We're thinking about, hey, what's the effect on structural transformation? Right? What's the effect on all these things? Indeed, policymakers are eventually worried about these things, and those are kind of objectives of these policies. But often policymakers are demanding much more short-term things and much more different outcomes, much more outcomes that are more upstream, causally speaking. Is investment actually getting to where it is? Is there policy bite? Right? Do we see the intermediate outcomes that should bear out eventually in growth or increases in value added and increases in productivity? Do we see those intermediate outcomes manifesting? A lot of our work as econometricians is not geared towards answering those types of questions, right? And we're often worried about very abstract quantities relative to these very kind of in the weeds, real world, real economic quantities that again, policymakers are kind of demanding of us and that we actually hope are being realized, if this stuff is at all working. And so a good example of kind of this misalignment of timelines really kind of showed its face during the first years of the Biden administration. And I'm not trying to be political, I'm just trying to be very descriptive with what we saw, which is, and I see this across domains, is people were very early to deem, and still are, I think, quite early to deem some of the CHIPS policies, for instance, as failures, right? And they would appeal to export numbers. They would appeal to chip fabrication numbers. But when you think of a chip fab, a chip plant, just a couple years out from this policy being first announced and starting to be implemented, a fab takes years. It takes years to kind of bear out. And outcomes, so from a lot of our research, outcomes like export comparative advantage is a very long-run artifact. It's a very long run. It might take decades to emerge. Right? It takes decades maybe to build comparative advantage of a certain product, in a certain industry, in a certain sector. Right? So I think we're much too early often with the way we deem policy success or failures. And I think a perfect example of that is China. The business press and the editorial sections of economic press around the world, I think, are littered with examples of people prematurely announcing the failures of Chinese industrial policy, probably to our detriment, and not taking actually their effects seriously. These are long-run things. We should evaluate them often as long-run outcomes and really pay attention to the intermediate things that are working. And a great example of that is think of learning by doing. Think of a cost curve, right? The theory of a lot of industrial policy is predicated on a curve like this, that through time our costs should go down, right? This is a slide from a trade class I teach, right? That through time we hope that costs are being brought down, that things are being brought down, right? And often we're evaluating things like around the A, right? We're evaluating things that we're actually, by implementing industrial policy, we know that there's not a comparative advantage, often in the entities, in the sectors, and product groups that we're targeting. We know that. And as any dynamic policy should, it should bring down those costs per theory. That's a theoretical rationale of a lot of industrial policies, that through time, we maybe build some labor productivity, et cetera, and costs come down, we become internationally competitive, right? That's a textbook classic theory of industrial policy, right? And so you saw a lot of this at the beginning. For instance, I'm just taking two examples, total anecdotes, right? This is me cherry picking. But I think they're very, very illustrative of something we get wrong, which is we're very premature in evaluating success and failure, right? And you got all these kinds of, a lot of hand-wringing early on during the CHIPS policy about, oh, look how unproductive look how unproductive American workers are in these TSMC chip plants. Oh, this is doomed to fail. These are failures. And hey, they could still be failures. But just this is the next year, you saw that productivity per this simple model of learning by doing, right? You produce output, costs go down, you become more productive, you see productivity increase, right? We should see these things dynamically, and we should evaluate them dynamically. But we always conflate these things. We always conflate the long run, where we want to go, and short run outcomes. I think, again, often to our detriment. And so some practical points here, right? What does this mean practically? I think practically as econometricians, we often focus on really abstract stuff that we should focus on. We should focus on TFP. We should focus on measuring things like productivity in fancy ways and in very, very technical ways. And we should develop those tools. I myself am kind of in the trenches of that. We all are, many of us as economists are in the trenches of that. But the things that were really, really important, the things I see are becoming even more important as we start kind of becoming, as we start kind of implementing industrial policy at scale, such as what was seen in IRA or CHIPS, is that really kind of basic stuff really mattered. Things like high-frequency measurements of, hey, is construction coming online, right? And a lot of this basic stuff, again, not structural measures of productivity, that's a really downstream thing, but the basic kind of upstream things, is construction happening? Is investment happening? Was the stuff that was very, very important. And one thing we realized very quickly, and those of us kind of looking at IRA and CHIPS saw very quickly was, oh, there wasn't this data, or this data wasn't collected and centralized in a way that allowed us to kind of do these on-the-ground real-time evaluations. These things really, really matter. This isn't fancy stuff. This is stuff that's like kind of in the trenches of doing the hard statistical work of saying, hey, is this stuff coming online? Are things moving in the way we hope it's moving, right? And this often meant that we had to, in a lot of groups, a lot of non-government groups, here, Rhodium and the group at MIT that we talk to and work with a bit, they had to build up from the ground up kind of data sets on investment, on where investment was going, where it was flowing. Again, this isn't a downstream outcome causally like output or exports or anything. This is really, really basic stuff, but a lot of the basics were missing. A lot of the basic measurements and statistical facilities and nuts and bolts of, hey, is stuff being implemented? That was missing. And as like econometricians, again, working at a very high level, we were like, oh, this stuff really, really matters. And this is the stuff people would ask us far more about, right, than fancy research design or fancy econometric models or structural models, et cetera, right? And I think this stuff is really, really the stuff that matters, right? And I think relatedly, even more so, just as much as measuring the kind of, hey, is investment coming online? Is K or I in our production function moving in the ways we hope it's moving as a result of a policy? Is measuring the policy itself, right? It might sound like something, again, very simple, right? Very pedestrian. But one thing that was clear in the US and clear in a lot of countries doing industrial policies, there actually isn't a lot of legibility of the policies themselves. Like, is the policy actually flowing to a firm? Are things actually being disseminated and kind of allocated, right? And when we see the bottlenecks and saw the bottlenecks of IRA and CHIPS, again, this is an empirical description of the world, right? The failures that were quickly kind of manifest and very clear and salient are implementation teething issues. Things like, a lot of subnational regulation stuff or subnational governance issues really became bottlenecks to the dissemination of policy on the ground. This isn't fancy stuff. And so measuring things like, hey, is policy actually being deployed? Measuring the basic kind of nitty-gritty on-the-ground stuff like that end up really, really mattering. I think it is an essential part of industrial policy because without the policy itself, measuring the outcome of policy doesn't matter, right? Is actually are shovels hitting the dirt? Is money getting disseminated? And I think a lot of industrial policy failures are actually failures of policy implementation. That might not sound like an insane idea to many people in this audience, but as economists, it's something we completely ignore. And I think it's often something we ignore broadly. We can see we ignore it in the data that we have, where this stuff is not tracked. In fact, the kind of industrial policy apparatus of the US has really not been mapped. People like Gordon Hanson, Danny Roderick, and people at HKS are having to do it from the ground up, right? So that's to say the legibility of things, not just investment, not just intermediates, the kind of legibility of actually on the ground what's happening is stuff that equally matters. And this is all to say the fancy stuff, yes, is very important. Yes, there was this kind of missing literature. Yes, there is a mismatch between the literature on econometric evaluation of industrial policy and the extent to which industrial policy is becoming more and more important to the world. There is a wedge between those two things. But I want to caution that blinkering us to measuring really, really important upstream outcomes that are basic and not sexy, and things that take hardcore and hard investments in having statistical capacity on the ground. Because as we saw with the country having to relearn to do industrial policy at scale, this stuff was very, very important. And I'll end it there. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Let me start by thanking the invitation from OECD, very nice invitation. Also congratulate the organizing committee for this event. Just some quick disclaimers before I start. So over the past 5 years, I had the privilege to be director of the Cabinet for Strategy and Studies from the Ministry of Economy in Portugal, and also participate in the GFP works. My presentation today will basically address an ongoing industrial policy project we have been running in Portugal since 2024. I used to be part of the national team, so there are members from 3 ministries, from economy, finance, and presidency. I will now join the steering committee, but hopefully today I can share some key ideas that emerged from this learning project with a series of, so the steering committee, but also other stakeholders that have been addressed, which include business participants, industrial associations, other services from public administration, also the government, to get the feedback and the opinion from the ecosystem, and actually plan or think of an industrial policy in Portugal. The project is basically composed of 3 work streams, one regarding a framework, both the existing and new industrial policy initiatives, then a second work stream regarding the monitoring and evaluation stages, the one which we are currently undergoing, and then a third one regarding governance. So my 3, including the 3 messages I would like to share with you today. The first one goes to the challenging landscape. So industrial policy is definitely not new. We all have been talking about it today. There's a series of industrial policy instruments underway in all countries and economic blocs, but definitely the current or the most recent landscape has been posing a number of challenges. First, for the pace of change, but also for the disruption and the nature of the impacts. And we mean technological, geopolitical, environmental, health, and so on. We've been mentioned demographics as well. So this challenging landscape was the starting point for us in Portugal to start analyzing the available or the existing industrial policy instruments on an individual standpoint, but also jointly, because at the end of the day, and again, we've been discussing this today, it's not just about one instrument, meaning financial, tax, human resources, science, technology, and innovation, foreign direct investment promotion. It's not just about one instrument, but the combination and the alignment of those instruments, those available, and in this case, existing instruments. So on the one hand, we started discussing the alignment of how to get goals and performance aligned, and how to get the most out of the combination of these existing instruments. But also we discussed, and we've been discussing, what we've called a new set of industrial policy instruments that emerged exactly from the responses to this challenging context. For instance, during COVID-19 and with the recovery and resilience programs in Europe, there was a series of new instruments, and these have been in Portugal mostly network-based, so they're just not targeted at individual firms, and they're increasingly becoming based in a collaborative arrangement. So this, again, is something that is part of an answer to the challenging landscape. And we also found room for improvement in this context. And we came up with this interesting concept of super additionality. So rather than, or to avoid some potential overlapping between goals and performance in some existing instruments, this combination and this mapping and understanding how these instruments can have an interplay can actually promote this joint value added of instruments. And in this context, we propose that the public administration should have an enabler role, namely through public procurement, and this idea of developmental and functional procurement. So here a proactive role on the public policy side. But also the challenging landscape, so this complex and interconnected set of new trends is making us reflect on the unit of analysis for industrial policy, really. So Portugal, as a small and open economy, should not only be looking at sectors, meaning sectors in the statistical sense, but also on technologies, on global value chains, so how does Portugal positions in certain value chains, in ecosystems, how does Portugal is integrated in those industrial ecosystems, and in this sense, so the idea more than horizontal versus vertical approaches, there are these other units that actually look at the competitive advantages of a country and its pattern of specialization that can contribute to the definition of an industrial policy. So my second key message that I would like to share today is related to the national space for action. So when we also agree that industrial policy has many layers, meaning geographical, meaning the number and the variety of stakeholders and their interplay. So again, we think that there is an opportunity for a national industrial policy that does not compete or that does not conflict with the main, with the main European priorities, but instead it complements and it contributes to the implementation of that policy. And by that we mean, first of all, resources like natural resources or intermediary products, but also human resources, meaning qualifications, skills, also the infrastructure, and very importantly as well, the scientific and technology, scientific technology and innovation system or ecosystem. So these are important resources, and the interplay, which will also form the positioning of the country and its competitive advantages, are also very important, and making the most out of these resources and from this interplay can also and should also be an important source of contribution to the European Union priorities of digital, of green, of strategic autonomy, and our positioning in international trade. And here we find that the public administration can have an enabler role, meaning that by cutting red tape or by improving the cross-ministerial coordination of the types of instruments that are provided or offered, is actually important for businesses to make the most out of these instruments. And finally, my third key message that is emerging from this learning project of the Industrial Policy Strategic Assessment Project is that these new instruments and the responses to the challenging landscape are actually challenging the governance and the monitoring and evaluation mechanisms themselves. So from the traditional, I would say, individual types of instruments, we are now experiencing more network-based industrial policy instruments. And in this sense, rather than bottom up, it should come, rather than just top-down initiatives, getting the most out of the number of stakeholders and their resources to contribute to these instruments is certainly a very interesting and important topic, and that's a feedback we've been getting in Portugal, mainly from the business side. So they're not that much interested on their sector, but also on the technologies impacting, on their positioning on the value chain again. And so this is really a key input, and I would say a dynamic input, as Nathan was also putting it. It's not something static that we'll just publish as a document or as a strategy. So this idea that we are moving on to more network-based industrial policy instruments is actually challenging and also reflecting the dynamic nature of the scientific, technological, and innovation ecosystem that, as we all know, substantially contributes to the industrial policy outcomes. So I would highlight this idea that collaboration is a key pillar of industrial policy at various levels and geographies, and it's impacting at different stages of public policy. So starting with design, the idea that networks and linkages, and I'm providing here an example in Portugal, the mobilizing agendas, they are basically collaborative arrangements that emerged with the RRP program, so with our response to COVID-19. There are more than 50 underway, and they're basically cross-sectoral. So this idea of cross-fertilization is actually being tested in Portugal, and these participants, which should mostly be business, have contracted a series of indicators, performance indicators, meaning new products or services. Also on the monitoring side, this idea of aligning, of mapping all the available instruments and these new collaborative instruments is also challenging the idea of how to connect performance with goals. So how do we monitor? How do we measure the results? But also the evaluation. When we move on to more network-based with more collaborative arrangements, we should also be looking at methodologies and the frequency, again, as Nathan put it very well, the frequency of those evaluations to understand what is the point or for how long should we wait until we actually get results from industrial policy. And finally, on the governance side, of course, it's a very important part to reinforce the ecosystem, so to bring together and to make sure that it's not just about, again, a top-down initiative, but a kind of a constant bottom-up feedback where businesses, industrial association, and again, the public administration, the services, are available to discuss and to make the most out of this policy. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Kyogan. I am the Director of Economics at the Ellison Institute of Technology in Oxford, but I'm not really here for that reason. I'm here because for the best part of 3 decades, I've worked in and around UK growth policy broadly defined, either on working on specific kind of policy domains like skills or regional policy, or on the strategies, and more recently as Chief Economist in the old business department. Don't worry, I am not going to take you through 3 decades of UK industrial policy, but I will be asking specific questions of the audience, so you can't completely doze off at this point. Let's move on. So I really want to talk about practice and what we've experienced during that period to help kind of understand and shape some of the discussion. I want to focus on broadly four areas, and some of these have already been touched on, but I think there's particular kind of UK nuance that I think would be relevant here. I want to pick up definitions. What do we actually mean when we're talking about these issues? I want to reflect a bit on the history, which does to some extent, colour or contaminate some of the discussions, certainly in the UK context. I want to think a bit about consistency over time, and whether there is any and how that manifests, and then thinking a bit more about measurements. Measurements has continually come up during the day, and I think there are some particular dimensions that we should probably should explore. So definitions. Definitions are important because it helps provide precision, helps you think about what you measure, helps you think through the kind of the policy options. And the way I've been kind of thinking through this over time is there are, broadly speaking, there's a difference between an industrial strategy and industrial policy. I think we have heard a bit about this during the day. An industrial strategy is a deliberate vision and direction for the sectoral composition. It is ministers and officials taking a view about what kind of economy they want to have and how that should develop. Now, typically, that will be in the direction of growing living standards, but it may be something else. It may be providing more resilience. It may all be energy security. There'll be different options, but it's a deliberate choice about what you do, and that has been a kind of a re-emergence in recent years about how things have developed. Having a strategy implies coordination across policy domains. It involves thinking through trade-offs. And perhaps just two to kind of illustrate. Any of you kind of reading the Financial Times recently will have seen that the UK government is currently in a discussion with its pharmaceutical sector about essentially drug pricing. Now, the way that is being played out, there are trade-offs, right? So the UK government does seem to be wanting to say that there's a difference between the science base and commercialisation, the great opportunities which are there in the UK to commercialise and develop medicines, and a question around what should be paid. The industry is saying, well, it's a bit more complicated than that. And so thinking through those trade-offs which are real is a crucial part of thinking through your industrial strategy. Another issue that's similar on this is around skills. So, we will always say skills are very important, developing human capital is really important. Many of the presentations today talk to that. But again, in an industrial strategy context, what does that actually mean? Typically, many skill systems will be demand responsive. You will have people will choose what they want to do. But if you're saying your economy needs to look like something different, the output needs to look different, the employment structure needs to look different, then you've got to start thinking around, well, how does your training system train in advance of that? And that's a big shift. And again, it creates different trade-offs. It implies, to some extent, redundancy in systems, overtraining. Things have to be thought through. Industrial policy, in my experience, has been really around the practical implementation of the strategy by using specific tools around tax, regulation and grants aimed at specific industries. It's the vertical bit when we talk vertical and horizontal. And I think when people think about industrial strategy policy, that's what they often have in their mind. I think that's partly to do with the history of this particular policy domain, because those tools, which are enormously powerful, having wielded them, they are really powerful instruments, are often used for other purposes. And typically that's been around, certainly in the UK context, some extent slowing down structural adjustment or leaning against it, active regional policies. And to some extent that has contaminated the brand. That I think if you look over the long term, one of the reasons why industrial policy, industrial strategy disappeared as a policy domain was because of the perceived failures of the kind of misuse of industrial policy tools in the kind of later half of the 20th century. So I just want to talk a bit about the history there. Right. Questions. We all recognize the plane. Yeah? Concorde. What's the thing next to it? Pardon? To the right. To the right. What's this? Chip. What kind of chip? Arm. Very good. Good audience. You know what you're going. What's the A stand for? Not advanced. It's good, but it's not right. Stands for acorn. So the story is, in the 1970s, when you talk in the UK, you will think about Concorde as a kind of industrial policy example that doesn't work. Only 20 Concordes made, 14 enter service. It's a kind of an example of a essentially a failed industrial policy. Right? One of my predecessors as chief economist did the business case on it and said it would never work. At the same time, in Cambridge, the Ministry of Technology gives £12 million to support microcomputing activity. Right? That's about £200 million today. Right? And a lot of activity is spent, and over the 70s, you get a bit of a cluster going on in Cambridge. One of the businesses that spins up there is Acorn. Acorn in the start of the 80s wins a contract from the BBC to produce a microcomputer for classrooms called the BBC Micro. That is wildly successful. It's an example, actually, of advanced market commitment that Diane was talking about earlier. Wildly successful, allows Acorn to grow, and one of Acorn's subsequent developments is the Acorn Reduced Instruction Set Computer, that's the R, machine, M. And they end up commercializing that, they go into joint ventures, and the ARM chip that is in everyone's iPhone has a long history in terms of, comes essentially from that small beginning. And it points to, I think, the point earlier around, when you judge industrial policy, at what point are you judging it? Because during these two policies are basically operating at the same time. During the kind of 70s, during kind of Tony Benn's stewardship of the industry department and Mintech. And, we think of one of them, we don't think of the other. The bottom two. Now, I think there's at least one person in the audience who should know one of these. Paul? Which one? Nissan is bottom left. What's the other one? Anyone? You're going to pass on it? MG. Pardon, that's true. That's MG Rover at Longbridge in the Midlands, which kind of collapsed in 2006. Again, UK car industry, subject to industrial policy is working on both of these domains. One goes bust. One is the most successful, most productive car plant in Europe, 5,500 people, gigafactories and everything. And I think the point here is they're both subject to industrial policy. Industrial policy has different kind of impacts, right? It has different impacts, and there is nuance required when judging it, but also when appraising it. And I think what was really good about the most recent industrial strategy from the UK was actually the technical annex, which really went and set out a really clear set of thinking about how we should go about this, because the history basically is misrepresented, and you need to be thinking very clearly about what you're trying to achieve. Right, now my colleagues may not thank me for this. So I have fed the last 4 industrial strategies into a word cloud generating machine. Does anyone wish to guess which is the most recent? So, bottom right. Why do you think that? Pardon? Investment, very good. But it is the bottom right. Well done. I've showed a few people, and you're the first to get it right. So the point is, right, what's interesting about these documents, now it's really unfair. It's an unfair piece of analysis to do, because these documents are inevitably, if they're supply-side economic reform documents, they'll have a lot of the same material in them, right? So to an extent, they will look similar, and they are similar. But there's some interesting there are some differences, which I think, again, illustrates some of the change over the last 14 or so years. So just to kind of be completist on this, the top left is new industry, new jobs. The last one in the previous Labour government. The first one that really began talking about industrial activism. The one next to it is the Greg Clark, 2017. Bottom corner is a plan for growth. Then is the most recent one. And you see some differences, right? So what you see, for example, growth is very small in the first one, because we thought in 2009 it would come back. Much bigger now, because we're worried about it. Right? You see, Fred Perry sort of gave the clue this morning. Focus on sectors. Sectors doesn't really appear earlier on. Gets a bit bigger in the 2017 one. Much more focus here. Everyone talks about new, and even if they're not necessarily. You see services appearing in this one. You also have energy. So you see the strategies beginning to take notice of what's, the context in which we're operating. But actually the main insight I think to take from this is they're very similar, right? They are. And if you do the kind of the textual analysis, they're about 80% similar. Right? Now, I think the point there is we create these strategies, and governments do, and amplify their novelty, but the underlying analysis, policy-making, philosophy is actually very similar, but we don't get the gains from pre-committing. Rather than saying this is the strategy, we're going to do this and give businesses certainty, which is something we heard a lot about, we don't necessarily lay that down. And therefore, we're missing an opportunity to kind of lock in that certainty and encourage a kind of better climate for growing the economy. So I think, the discussion this morning around creating institutions to help provide that, the Industrial Strategy Council, putting it on a legislative basis, that could really help in terms of kind of locking this way of thinking, this approach into policy making in a way that, it hasn't, we've been sort of leaving that particular £5 note on the floor by not properly committing. And my final one is just about measurement. I did spend some time in the ONS, and this is in no way to throw any shade at my colleagues at the back from the ONS, but measurement is really hard and it's really important. And it's really important, as we saw this morning with the presentations around intangibles, and these are things that we don't tend to measure very well. I think the point here is, fundamentally, industrial strategies tend to be on a difficult wicket because they're always trying to move to the new thing, and the new thing is not well measured if it's measured at all. And the thing that really struck me, and again, Diane talked to this morning, is the way we do GDP measurement, which we do brilliantly, but it's based on a set of international standards that were issued in 2008. The iPhone was issued in 2007. Right? So the world we're trying to measure is a world that's basically pre-iPhone, because it will have been in draft for 2 or 3 years before that. And you think about, look at the charts, look at the change in the way people are behaving, how they're consuming, how they're spending their time. It is kind of wildly different from the world that the SNA in 2008 was trying to measure. And I'm old enough to think before that, the world of, say, SNA 93 looked a lot like 2008. 2008 doesn't really look like where we currently are. And so there are parts of the economy that are just unmeasured or mismeasured. Andrew Bailey, the Governor of the Bank of England, talked about this at the Mansion House speech not far from here earlier this year. He thinks that, if you're just measuring data as an asset, could add a couple of percentage points to GDP. And there's a whole range of other areas where we need to get better measured, let alone the kind of micro-level data that people need to do evaluations. So I think, Diane talked about industrial policy being too important to leave to finance ministries. Again, one of the things I think it's important for kind of the economic policy-making community is that measurement is too important to be left to the statistical communities. They do a great job, but we should be really demanding about the kind of things they do and how where they allocate resource, how they move to measure the economy that we have. Because if we don't do that, then we're going to be constantly misunderstanding the economy that we actually have. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We have about 15 minutes for questions. We are beautifully ahead of time, and I'll tell you what the secret is that we lied to the panelists about how much time they have. So whoever's organising the conference next year, that is my top tip to you. Can we have hands up in the room for any questions, please? Right at the back, Ollie, I think.
Thanks very much. I'm Ollie from the Department for Business and Trade. I had a question about what we count as industrial policy. So like going back to the definitions a bit, I think I usually think of grants, tax expenditures, financial instruments, and that's what we see in quiz and other data sets, for example. But we've heard advanced market commitments come up a couple of times. Mike, you mentioned them, Diane mentioned them earlier. I mean, how much should we think of procurement in general as industrial policy? Because, I mean, reflecting on the UK case, we probably spend about 10 times more through procurement than we do through tax expenditures, grants, and financial instruments combined. So I guess how much do you think of procurement as industrial policy, and how important do you think it is relative to those other three levers? Thanks.
Thank you. Does anyone want to answer that? I might add a little bit on of saying, like, how do you think it can be used a bit more effectively by governments? Guy, do you want to kick off?
Yes, I'm going to answer on whether public procurement should be considered as industrial policy or not. And it's really a complex question, and I would be happy to have your opinion on this. Just a few thoughts. Think about, the construction of a roundabout. I think in most countries would be considered as, public procurement, but not as industrial policy. Now think of innovative procurement, procurement for innovative goods. In most countries, it would be considered as both public procurement and industrial policy. Now there are some more uncertain cases. Think about something very concrete, a scrappage scheme for gas boilers or public procurement for purchase of gas boilers. In a given country where you will have production of gas boilers, this can certainly be considered as industrial policy, whereas in other countries where gas boilers are imported, this will certainly not be considered as industrial policy. So I think the definition can vary also across countries depending on the industrial base. So this is, where to draw the line exactly between in public procurement, what is industrial policy and what is not is very complex.
Thank you, Guy. Mike?
Yeah, I think an interesting one would be, say, contracts for difference. So in energy auctions, that's an advanced market commitment. It's been wildly successful in generating deployments of wind in the North Sea, and it's also had some spillover benefits in terms of manufacture. So an interesting point, that's been a very effective one. We probably don't think of it as an industrial policy. It's predominantly a climate one, but it's had industrial consequences, and it utilises the kind of the tools that Ollie was talking about.
Right, thank you. Do we have any more questions in the room? Yes, James, I think. I'm going to ask you to dig deep, guys. I know it's the last session.
Thank you very much. So I'm James, I'm in Sravia and Ollie's team, and I'm very selfishly asking a question about industrial policy, considering we've just been working on one, and particularly what level which industrial policy should be operating on. I was wondering whether the panel had a view on that. In some parts of the world, it's delivered regionally. Our industrial policy has big interactions in relation to place. So I was wondering whether, in your experience and view, do you have a basic view on how it should be implemented and by whom?
I want to take that. Mike, I'll come to you after on that.
I think my answer will be frustrating. It depends. It depends whether,
I'm glad that finally an economist in this conference said it depends is the answer. We've been waiting for this all day.
it depends where the market where the market failure is functioning, right? It depends what dimensionality we're really concerned with. I think in the case of most place-based policies, it's clear, right? It's clear that there's a geographic dimension, and the market failures are such that they have a real local labor market dimension that we should be mindful of and try to target. I think there's good reasons for targeting them. I think there's negative externalities that justify that type of thing. But that's to say, I think that you can think of many other policies that do not have a geographic dimension per se, right? Where that wouldn't be the main unit that one would target. It really, really depends on the scope of the market failure one is trying to address. And I know that's a frustrating reply.
Mike, thank you.
Yeah, I agree with that. You correct the market failure at the functional economic area which it operates. But I think that perhaps where my thinking shifted over 20 years on this is, I think there's something around who's got the most skin in the game on it, who is most incentivized to pull it off and make it really, really work, and to get it away from some of the kind of more technocratic. And I do think that, if you think about the kind of the evolution of governance in particular within England, you've got to be thinking that a lot more probably could be executed by mayoral combined authorities, the people who kind of, who are advocating for their place and are highly incentivized to get it right.
Joanna?
Can I just add, maybe the pattern of specialization can play a role here. So if you have like a regional cluster that will again promote collaboration between central administration and the regional authorities. So I think it also depends, besides the market failure, on this topic of specialization and competitive advantages.
We've got a couple of really good questions online, which I'll take first. So I think this is mainly addressed to Nathan and Mike, but please, anyone on the panel, do take it. We've made progress in analyses measuring the causal impact of industrial policy, but these studies take a lot of time, while external validity is a concern. Are there ways to generate more timely, context-specific evidence on the effectiveness of these policies?
No, it's a good question. I mean, frustratingly, I think a lot of industrial policy is kind of a long-run phenomenon. We're trying to change an equilibrium. We're trying to change the composition of activity that's occurring in an economy, right? We're trying to change an equilibrium outcome. So by construction, we're thinking really long-term, right? And so there's a discomfort there with the need to kind of manifest and think about what's happening in a short-term period. And we've made a lot of progress with causal estimation. I think we can pay attention to a lot of intermediate outcomes that do matter. They might not be as rigorous or as satisfying as the ultimate outcomes that we are after, but I think they can be important weather vanes in showing the directionality of industrial policy and whether it's functioning in the right direction. Are we moving down the cost curve, right? Are things moving in the directions they should move in order for us to manifest those final outcomes, those downstream outcomes? So.
Yeah, so I think, so this is a really interesting question because effectively this is an area of policy making itself where that has been subject to kind of technological change that we haven't fully exploited. And the reason for that is, one of the reasons why historically evaluation has been used is because collecting data was expensive, right? And so if you wanted to understand whether a policy worked or not, you had the choice. You either spent a lot of money on a monitoring system that would be almost certainly kind of analog, that require people to take paperwork in, add up, and all the rest of it, or you waited and then you evaluated. And what's happened is obviously digitization means that effectively monitoring is free. If you design your policy right up front, the admin data spills off it and you're able to work out whether it's making the right kind of progress. Then you don't necessarily have to wait for the evaluation. But I think that means recognizing that that's happened. And I just want to perhaps give a really good an example of that. During the pandemic, we had a program around green homes grants. And because the team took the time, and I think Zeb earlier was involved in this, the team took the time to specify what they thought was going to happen. Not the outcome, but actually intermediate. They spent the time to work out the MI system, and then they put it in place. And what that meant, it was very clear early days that this program was nowhere near executing at the level it needed to do. And that meant they were able to act early, act on an evidence base to do so, and avoid kind of the resource costs of running something that didn't really work for a long period. So I think that's what I'd be encouraging is, think really hard about what your intermediate outputs look like, hard code them into your delivery system so you can watch it as it unfolds as it happens.
Guy, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just to mention that as most industrial policies are implemented because they are supposed to have spillovers, what we need to also measure is these spillovers to ensure that in the end we get what we wanted in the first place. But, being cognizant that this is extremely complicated, we will also have to rely beyond causal impact on what Nathan mentioned, much more basic indicators of what industrial policies are delivering.
Thank you. And we've got another question now that really acknowledges how important the political economy elements are to industrial policy implementation. How do political pressures and bureaucratic constraints shape industrial policy in ways that theoretical models may overlook? And how can policymakers account for them? Go on, Nathan.
Yeah.
You made the mistake of moving your head slightly.
I have a really good paper on this. If you want to read a really kind of broad overview of how we think about this. It's in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, myself and Rekha Juhas, and it's open access. But I think it's the part we underestimate the most as economists. And I know that's like that might seem glib, but I do think it's true. I think a lot of we're thinking about technical models. blabbered on about thinking about market failures and targeting market failures and a very technocratic explanation of how I think we should target industrial policy. I think that's only part of the puzzle, right? I think we pay far less attention to the political constraints that govern the allocation and ultimate success of industrial policy. We don't really, I think we haven't done well at even articulating really how those constraints look, what they look like, and how they shape policymaking. We might have a sense of these dynamically. We might have a sense that, like, well, you know, there's certain dynamic issues, political business cycles that we have to overcome in designing this stuff. But I do not think we've articulated as well as, say, the macroeconomic literature has or the fiscal policy literature has. I think that's where we should do the most work because ultimately it comes down to the politics of implementing and choosing the right policy. The technocratic element is almost second order. It's like, do politics support the technocratic outcome? And I'll say there. Yeah.
Joanna?
I will add that maybe this dimension, has to do with red tape. But on a positive note, what we are putting forward in Portugal is to actively improve the cross-ministerial coordination. So there are a lot of agencies, a lot of services, because I'll give you the Portuguese example. So the Ministry of Economy has the Foreign Direct Investment Agency, the SMEs agency, but then the environmental topics are in a specific ministry, the digital topics are with an agency from another ministry, and again, also the finance for tax policy on another ministry. So this real time, let's call it, and this ability to coordinate and align the instrument is critical. And one topic or one stage is the decision, but then the implementation is very much dependent on the very structure of each government in each country, for instance, and the ability of these ministries to coordinate and to provide guidelines or improve the rules for decisions of these agencies. Because at the end of the day, each and I had this experience with the service I was running, each service has its own mission, its own goals, and we need to shift the paradigm of running in, so this collaborative paradigm needs to be extended to the public administration side.
Thank you. Mike, final word?
I think I would agree with that.
Right, brilliant. I'm gonna. Oh, did you want to come back in?
Yeah, I want to squeeze in one thing
that
she reminded me of, and I think it's a great point. Is that one thing I've noticed just studying the history of industrial policy? I don't think there is a case of successful industrial policy where the government hasn't really invested in state capacity. I do not think you could find one. I think that's like the crux of it. It's easier said than done, but I think that's a stylized fact that really matters. Sorry.
No, brilliant, amazing point. Okay, do you have one final burning question from the room? No, then we'll call it there. Thank you. What an amazing panel and brilliant set of insights. Thank you so much. Yeah. And now, just to make sure you're not confused, I'm stepping back into my chair at my role as compere, okay? And I just wanted to say, if I was on my phone a bit in that, was not because I wasn't listening, but it's because I've got an amazing new set of housekeeping points for all of you. I know you've been exciting and waiting for it. So we will wrap up. This is the end of today. So I'm going to do a very quick summary of the day and a few logistics, particularly for this evening and for tomorrow. So if you bear with me for another 5 minutes, and I promise I will get you out of here. So firstly, just a huge thank you for everyone who spoke today, everyone who's attending, everyone's posing questions online and in person. That's absolutely brilliant. And just to draw out a few little messages. So I think looking across the day, it is just quite evident how over the last 10 years of the GFP, our appreciation of industrial policy, our sophistication in the way that we think about it, and the nuance in the way we think about it has massively progressed. And actually there is a lot of consensus in the room, isn't there, about kind of the purpose of industrial policy, what the key policy levers are, and some of the outstanding challenges, things like measurement. And obviously we've made a lot of progress in developing that understanding, but there's a lot more to go. So basically come back next year, please. So I think I'll leave it there. I'm very sorry to my team that's painstakingly made notes on everything, but we're timing out. I can read these to anyone that wants at the session, or I'll give them to Ben to read out. Basically now, this is the end of the formal agenda today. We now have our evening reception at the Barbican Conservatory, which the speeches will start around 7:30, so please make sure you are there by 7 in order to hear the speeches, and then you can mingle and enjoy yourself. It's about a 10-minute walk from here, and either you can just use Google Maps to get there, or there will be members of my team stood by the registration desk who will just take groups of people every 10 minutes if you need to find your own way. And between then, your time is yours. So if you want to go for a lovely bracing walk around London, if you want to hang out here, that is entirely up to you. And you can get there before 7 as well. So if you want to get there early and enjoy the conservatory, that's entirely up to you. Other notices. Please make sure that you return any charging units that you've borrowed back to the station there. Please hold on to your pass if you're planning to go this evening or you're planning to come back tomorrow so that we don't have to print new ones for you. Oh, there we go. I think that's it. And then and then there's a few members of the delegation who are taking, lucky them, a guided tour of the Barbican. If you are taking a guided tour of the Barbican, please can you be there by the coffee station at 5:45 with your bags, if you want to take your bags. If you don't want to take your bags, members of my team will collect your tickets and we will take your bags for you to the Barbican Conservatory so that you don't have to lug them around. Please don't fake it and pretend like you're going to the tour so that someone carries your bags to you. All right, I think that's it, unless I'm missing anything. No. Thank you very, very much. Brilliant day. See you tomorrow. See you this evening.